Welcome to Pseudobiblia. If you enjoy audio stories, consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel so you don't miss our weekly releases. Now, Pseudobiblia presents The Black River. This work is a work of fiction. Names, characters, places, and events are the product of the author's imagination or are used fictitiously. Any resemblance to actual persons, events, or places, existing or having existed, is purely coincidental. Enjoy your listening. The Black River, a novel written by Vittorio Vetusti. Chapter 1. The wind blew sharply from the Tigris, carrying with it the familiar smell of mud, fish, and something more subtle, the metallic scent of blood spilled not far from its banks. Pulling my rough wool cloak around my shoulders, I concluded my guard patrol along the western perimeter of the camp. 4 hours on watch, peering into the impenetrable darkness of the Mesopotamian plain, straining my ear to catch suspicious movements in the rustling of the reeds. But the Persians didn't move. Not yet. The moon, a thin silver crescent, barely illuminated the barren ground between our camp and the waterway. Under that spectral light, even the familiar figures of my companions seemed like shadows from the other world. I sighed, feeling the weight of my 42 years bearing down on my shoulders as never before. I handed the spear to my replacement, a young Arcadian with a pale face and eyes sunken from fatigue. He had the name of a hero, Telamonius, but neither his stature nor his courage, at least not yet. War will either make him grow or kill him, I thought. Nothing to report, I said mechanically. Just the river and the wind. He nodded without speaking, taking the spear with hands I noticed trembled slightly. A young man on his first campaign, far from the mountains of Arcadia. I could read in his eyes the same uneasiness that had gripped all of us since we learned of Cyrus's death at the Battle of Cunaxa. Victory turned to ashes in our hands. The certainty of promised gold evaporated like dew in the sun. And now this uncertain truce, this nerve-wracking waiting while Tissaphernes, the Persian satrap, wove his plots around us like a patient spider. I headed toward my tent, crossing the silent camp. The fires were low, reddish embers fighting against the darkness. I recognized the different quarters of the camp from their orderly arrangement. The Spartans in the center, rigid and disciplined even in sleep, with their spears planted vertically in front of their tents like a metallic forest. The Boeotians and Thessalians in the lateral sectors, the former with their shields painted with bull emblems, the latter with their characteristic curved kopis resting at the entrance of their tents. My Athenian comrades near the river, always pragmatic in their choice of positions, water nearby for supplies, and an escape route if necessary. 10,000 men, 10,000 stadia from home, in a foreign land. 10,000 men who had defied the will of the gods by serving a barbarian against the legitimate sovereign for a handful of gold derricks. Mercenaries sold, but also warriors, hoplites, the best infantry in the known world. Men who had broken the Persian advance at Marathon, at Plataea, at Thermopylae. And now here we are, in the service of a Persian prince against his brother. The irony escaped none of us, least of all the gods. As I passed by the tent of the mantis, the priest diviner who accompanied the expedition, I noticed he was still awake. A sacred fire burned in a bronze brazier in front of his tent, and a flickering flame illuminated his thin, time-worn face as he examined something carefully. Perhaps the entrails of a sacrificial lamb, perhaps the flight of birds at dawn, tracing their paths on a wax tablet. I approached, drawn by the warmth and by an uneasiness I couldn't define. "What do the gods read for us, Mantis?" I asked, my voice lower than I intended, as if I feared waking some slumbering deity. He looked up, his eyes dark like wells of obsidian in which it was difficult to read. His white beard, braided in the Cretan manner, contrasted with his skin burned by the sun and the elements of 100 campaigns. "Cultures," he murmured, as if responding to a question I had not asked. "My name is Calchas, like the diviner who accompanied the Achaeans to Troy. A heavy name to carry for a humble servant of Apollo. What do the gods read for us, Calchas?" I repeated, an involuntary shiver running down my spine as I pronounced that famous name, associated with terrible prophecies. "Not good signs, Lykon of Athens," he replied, his mouth twisting into a bitter grimace. His voice was surprisingly melodious for such an elderly man. The liver was stained black on the left side, the heart was small, and in the sky tonight, Ares shines too intensely, while Athene hides behind the clouds. I felt a shiver run down my spine despite the heavy cloak. A presage of defeat, of death. The mantis threw a handful of resin into the brazier, which flared with a greenish glow. The smell of pine and something more bitter, perhaps myrrh, spread through the air. "Of change, certainly," he replied cautiously, watching the flames dance. "Of punishment, perhaps. The gods are restless. You are Athenian, Lykon. You know the story of Icarus." I nodded slowly. "He flew too close to the sun." "And fell into the sea," the mantis completed. "Hubris, excessive pride, always leads to a fall. And we, Lykon, how high have we flown? How close to the sun?" I did not answer, but it wasn't necessary. We both knew the answer. From the day we crossed the Euphrates, entering the domains of the King of Kings, I felt that we were committing an act of hubris, of arrogant pride that defied the cosmic order. Greek mercenaries fighting for a Persian usurper against his brother, the legitimate monarch. How could we expect the favor of Zeus or Apollo? I had fought in many battles. In Athens, in Sparta, in Thrace, in Egypt. I had killed and risked being killed. But never had I felt this sense of having offended something fundamental in the order of the world. I took leave of the mantis with a nod and continued toward my tent. On the way, I noticed a group of figures moving resolutely toward the eastern exit of the camp. I recognized the massive figure of Clearchus, the Spartan with the iron character and implacable gaze. Beside him walked Proxenus, the Boeotian with the milder temperament, under whose command I had served in this expedition. There were also Menon the Thessalian, with the fox-like face and the reputation of an opportunist, Agas the Arcadian, known for his devotion to Artemis, Socrates the Achaean, who had nothing of his Athenian namesake except baldness. All our generals, heading toward Tissaphernes' tent for a nighttime meeting. A feeling of unease gripped my stomach like an invisible fist. Why all together? Why at this hour? The moon was now high, the hour when commanders usually rested, preparing for the decisions of dawn. I wanted to call out to them, warn them, but of what? I had no evidence, only a dark presentiment, that kind of intuition that in Athens we call daemonian, a divine whisper, the kind of warning that Socrates, the real one, the philosopher, said he always listened to. "May Athene protect you," I murmured, as I saw them move away, escorted by a detachment of Persian horsemen with armor shining with golden scales, their lances held high in the moonlight. I noticed, with a new tremor of uneasiness, that the Persians were too numerous for a simple honor guard, at least 3 for each Greek. I finally reached my tent, where my shield and armor waited patiently, resting on an improvised tripod made of ash wood. The shield, an aspis of wood covered with bronze, showed the marks of battle. Dents, scratches, a dark stain that time had not erased Persian or Greek blood. By now it was impossible to tell. The armor, a thorax of leather reinforced with bronze plates, also bore the signs of a life spent fighting. A strap replaced after Aegospotami, a plate repaired after Amphipolis, a series of small notches that told the story of blows received and dodged. 42 years, 23 as a hoplite. I had fought against Spartans, Thebans, Persians, Thracians. I had seen men die in 1,000 ways, had killed with spear and sword, had seen cities burn and kings fall. I had been wounded 5 times, but never seriously. The gods had spared me, or perhaps they simply hadn't yet decided what end to reserve for me. Never, though, in all these years of war and blood, had I felt the uneasiness that gripped me now. It was as if Tartarus itself had breathed an icy breath on my neck. I lay down on the bed of straw covered with a goatskin without removing my chiton. I was too tired to pray properly, but before closing my eyes I whispered anyway, "Zeus, father of gods and men, protect us. Athene, goddess of wisdom and just war, illuminate our path. And you, Poseidon, lord of rivers and seas, calm the waters we will cross." Sleep wrapped around me like a heavy cloak, dragging me toward depths I could not imagine, toward dreams that were not just dreams. Chapter 2. I did not know how much time had passed when I reopened my eyes. But I was not in my tent. I was not in the camp. The sky above me was not the night sky of Mesopotamia, but a low vault, lead-colored, from which no sunlight filtered. An eternal twilight, immobile, as if time itself had stopped in a moment suspended between day and night. I rose with a start, surprised to find myself fully armed. Corinthian helmet lowered over my forehead, armor tight around my chest, greaves protecting my legs, shield already gripped in my left arm, spear steady in my right. The familiar weight of the armor should have comforted me, but there was something wrong, something different. The bronze of my armor appeared opaque, as if light refused to reflect off it. And my hands, I looked with horror at my hands, gripping the shaft of the spear, seemed almost transparent, as if they were slowly losing substance. Around me, a desolate plain stretched as far as the eye could see, with no visible boundaries. The ground was covered with grey ash that raised small vortices at my passing, as if responding to my movement. There were no trees, only a few withered shrubs, twisted into unnatural shapes, as if in the grip of a continual agony. The air was cold and still, devoid of the slightest breath of wind, laden with an odor of decomposition and sulfur that forced me to breathe through my mouth. This is not a common dream, I thought. It's something more. A vision, perhaps, or a journey of the soul, like those the followers of Orpheus spoke of in their secret ceremonies at Eleusis. My psyche had been transporting elsewhere while my body slept. And then I saw it, the river. It flowed slowly, viscous, its waters so dark they seemed like ink under that sunless sky. It was not the Tigris with its clay-colored water. It was not the Euphrates with its verdant banks. It was something else, something that did not belong to the world of the living. The Acheron, I whispered, remembering Homer's tales. But no, it couldn't be. The Acheron was the river of sorrow that flowed in Hades, and I was not dead. Not yet. The Cocytus, then, I murmured, thinking of the river of lamentation. Or perhaps the Styx, the river of hatred, through which even the gods feared to swear. But none of these names seemed to fit perfectly what I saw. This was a river without a name, or perhaps a river that had all the names of infernal waterways. The Black River, I whispered finally, and a shiver ran from my neck to my toes, as if I had pronounced a forbidden name, a name of power. Forward, form the lines! Clearchus's thundering voice made me turn abruptly, and I saw him, standing on a small rise in the terrain, imposing in his Spartan armor, the red cloak that waved in a wind I could not feel, a wind that seemed to exist only for him. Beside him were the other generals, Proxenus, Menon, Agis, Socrates. It was then that I realized I was not alone. Around me, extending in all directions, were thousands of Greek hoplites, organized according to their ethnic units, as if an entire phalanx had materialized from nowhere in this desolate land. I recognized my Athenian comrades, their well-maintained armor and intelligent faces now contorted in expressions of confusion and fear. Further away, I saw the Spartans, rigid and disciplined as always, but in their eyes there was a shadow I had never noticed before, an uncertainty that contradicted their legendary impassivity. Beyond, the Boeotians with their conical helmets adorned with griffin feathers, the Thessalians with shields painted with geometric motifs of meanders and spirals, the Arcadians with their spears slightly longer than normal, the Cretans with composite bows in hand. 10,000 Greeks arrayed in that dead land under a sky that was not a sky. "We must cross," announced Clearchus, pointing to the river with his ash spear, the tip gleaming with an opaque, unnatural light. "On the other side lies our salvation." I looked in the direction he indicated. In the distance, beyond the Black River, stood an imposing fortification. Its walls, black as obsidian, seemed to absorb what little light filtered from the leaden sky instead of reflecting it. There were no visible doors, nor windows, only sharp towers that rose like spears stretched toward the sky, and battlements that resembled the teeth of a primordial predator. "That fortress," I murmured, and an Athenian comrade beside me, Telephus, I recognized his sharp profile and reddish beard, shook his head gravely. "I don't like it," he said, gripping his spear more tightly. "There's something wrong with this place. The gods are not favorable to us here." He was right. I couldn't feel the presence of the Olympian gods. Not Athene with her protective wisdom, not Apollo with his purifying light, not Zeus with his patriarchal justice. Here reigned other deities, more ancient, darker. The chthonic gods, the underground powers. Hades, perhaps, or something even more primordial. Divinities that existed before the Olympians conquered the sky, entities that lived in the dark spaces between the stars and in the depths of the earth, where not even the light of Helios dared to penetrate. Yet we followed orders. What choice did we have? The army began to move toward the river, the orderly ranks advancing through the ash, shields raised, spears ready. The sound of footsteps was strangely muffled, as if the ash itself devoured the noise. The only clear sound was the collective breathing of 10,000 men, a breath that formed a pale mist in front of our faces, despite it not being cold enough to justify it. But the closer we got to the black waters, the more the feeling of malaise grew within me. It was a nausea that came not from the stomach, but from the soul itself, a repulsion that spoke of dangers more ancient than humanity. The first group of hoplites reached the shore. They were Spartans, of course, always the first to face danger, to push where others hesitated. I saw them stop, hesitate, a surprising reaction for warriors known for their impassivity, men who had been trained from childhood not to show fear in the face of anything. I saw them exchange glances, unthinkable behavior for soldiers used to obeying without discussion. Then, at a sharp order from a Lachagos, a company commander, they entered the river. The first scream froze the blood in my veins. A Spartan hoplite, a grey-bearded veteran who bore the scars of the Persian wars on his face, was screaming in terror as the black waters closed around his legs. It wasn't the cold, I immediately understood. It was something else. The water moved, contorted, as if it had a life of its own, or as if it were inhabited. "Forward!" Clearchus shouted again from the shore, but his voice had changed. There was a note of uncertainty I had never heard from him in battle. "Don't stop. Salvation is beyond the river." The ranks advanced, driven by discipline and fear of showing weakness. The terror of scorn was stronger than the terror of the unknown, a profoundly Greek trait, I reflected, as I prepared to enter the dark waters myself. Soon it was our turn, the Athenians, to enter the river. I took a step into the black water, and a supernatural cold enveloped me, penetrating through the greaves, climbing up my legs like serpents of ice. But it wasn't just the cold that made me tremble. I felt something moving around my ankles, grasping, pulling. I looked down and saw faces. Faces in the water, partially formed, like masks of semi-melted wax, eyes that stared at me from inscrutable depths, mouths that opened in silent screams, or perhaps whispered words in a language I did not recognize, but that filled me with ancestral terror, a language that perhaps existed before the Titans themselves walked the earth. "They are the dead," said Telephus beside me, his voice choked with panic, a hand instinctively seeking the amulet of Athene he wore around his neck. "The dead of the river, the unburied." He was right. They were the souls of the unburied, of those who had died without the appropriate rites, of those who had been forgotten, who had not received the obol for Charon. They were destined to wander in the Acheron for eternity, never reaching the Elysian fields or even the asphodel plains where common dead spent their post-mortem existence. But there was more. Some faces I recognized. They were the Persians we had killed at Cunaxa. They were Cyrus's soldiers who had fallen by our side. They were the civilians massacred during our march through the king's land, the villages razed to the ground, the women, the children. "Traitor," whispered a face that formed near my knee, black water, taking the semblance of a young Persian, whom I remembered piercing with my spear during the Battle of Cunaxa. I remembered his eyes, the way they had looked at me as life abandoned them, the blood that flowed from his mouth staining his well-groomed beard. "You served against the legitimate king. You defied the cosmic order. Now you will pay." I advanced anyway, pushed by the human current behind me. The army had transformed into a confused mass. Discipline was crumbling. I heard shouts in different dialects, the harsh Doric of the Spartans, the sung Aeolic of the Boeotians, the refined Ionic of the Athenians, the archaic Doric of the Cretans. I saw men I knew for their courage in 100 battles tremble and weep as the hands of the dead clutched at their legs, seeking to drag them toward the muddy bottom of the river. The Spartans, always so composed, now screamed like terrified children. The Boeotians prayed aloud, invoking deities that seemed deaf to their pleas. The Thessalians, suspicious by nature, accused each other of having led us into a trap. The Arcadians, accustomed to their sunny mountains, seemed completely out of place in this infernal environment of water and mist. The Cretans, famous archers, tried in vain to hit the shadows in the water, but their arrows passed through the liquid faces without effect, as if they were trying to pierce smoke. "The gods have abandoned us," someone shouted, and the phrase was repeated along the entire line, a wave of despair that spread faster than any contagion. We are lost. Yet we continued to advance. The black fortress seemed closer now, but somehow unreachable, as if every step we took toward it added two to the distance. An infernal mirage, a promise of salvation that receded as we pursued it. Then something even more terrible happened. The sky, already gloomy, rippled like a veil of cloth traversed by a shiver. It opened, revealing for an instant something beyond, not the blue of the daytime sky or the black of the starry night, but an abyssal void, a non-color that hurt the eye and the mind. From the torn sky, arrows of green fire began to fall, hitting the water and creating geysers of sulphurous steam that burned the skin like acid. The figures in the water emerged completely, assuming solid forms, warriors of vaguely Persian aspect, but with something deeply wrong in their proportions, in their unnaturally fluid movements, in their eyes that seemed wells of infinite darkness. They wore scale armor that seemed made of an unknown metal, black as night but reflective like a distorted mirror. "We cannot fight them," shouted Chaeresophus, the Spartan commander, his voice broken for the first time by terror, a terror that seemed out of place in the chest of a warrior who had faced death 100 times. "They are shadows, they are dead, they cannot be harmed." He was right. Our weapons, the ash spears with bronze tips that had defeated the Persian Empire, the swords that had traced the boundaries of 100 city-states, passed through their bodies as through smoke, while theirs, those strange curved blades that seemed made of solidified smoke, bit into our flesh, leaving no visible wounds, but draining something from us with each blow. The life force, perhaps, the soul itself. The battle transformed into a massacre. The Greeks, the best soldiers of the known world, were being cut down like stalks of grain by an invisible scythe. Our formation, the phalanx that had dominated 100 battlefields from Attica to Ionia, from Egypt to Thrace, dissolved into chaos and despair. I fought desperately, my spear slicing ineffectively through the air against enemies who could not be pierced. I freed myself of my shield, now more a burden than a protection, and gripped the short sword I carried at my belt, attempting quicker, more precise blows. Nothing. The metal hissed through the air with a wrong sound, not the sharp whistle of a blade cutting the air, but a distorted wail, as if the sword itself suffered for its impotence. Then a blow reached me at the shoulder. I did not feel the familiar stabbing pain of a war wound, but something much worse, a cold that penetrated to the bone, beyond the bone, to the soul itself. I felt a part of me being sucked away, as if the weapon had drunk directly from my psyche. The sensation was that of an icy wind blowing through the void left by what had been taken from me. It wasn't physical pain. It was something worse, as if parts of my memory, of my very identity, were being erased. For a terrible moment, I didn't remember my father's name. Then my mother's face vanished from my mind. The memory of my first battle, was it at Delium, or perhaps Potidea, vanished like smoke dispersed by the wind. The spectral weapons screeched with sounds that recalled human voices in agony, and each blow they delivered seemed accompanied by a fleeting chorus of whispers, laments, and curses in ancient and forgotten languages. I fell to my knees in the black water, the hands of the dead grasping more firmly, seeking to drag me down, toward a death that was not the end, but the beginning of an eternity of torment. Their bloodless fingers left traces of frost on my skin, a cold that did not belong to the world of the living, that penetrated beyond the flesh and froze the soul itself. "Zeus!" I shouted, my voice broken by desperation. "Apollo, Athene, if ever we were dear to you, help us now." But the Olympian gods were distant, deaf to our prayers, or perhaps it was they themselves who were punishing us for our hubris, for having dared to defy the natural order of things, for having served a Persian prince against his brother, the legitimate king, he who embodied the cosmic order in the land of the two rivers. Through the confusion of battle, I sought our generals with my gaze. Clearchus, with his imposing figure, now seemed diminished, overwhelmed by the horror of a battle that could not be won with discipline or brute force. Proxenus, always searching for divine signs, raised his eyes to the leaden sky, but found only cosmic indifference, a void that reflected the void we were becoming. Menon, the Thessalian with the ambiguous air, seemed almost at ease in this hell, as if he had somehow foreseen it, or perhaps even desired it. His face, illuminated by a greenish glow coming from the river, showed not fear but a sort of grim satisfaction. As I tried to rise, supporting myself with the sword stuck in the silty bottom, I saw something change in the battle. The shadows seemed to retreat, not in defeat, but as if obeying a silent command. The water of the river began to calm, the faces of the dead to dissolve, leaving behind only an opaque black surface, motionless like molten glass. "They're retreating," someone shouted, and the phrase was repeated along the entire line, a wave of hope that spread among the Greeks as the Spartans and Athenians regrouped. But it wasn't a retreat. It was a truce, or perhaps a more subtle deception. For now, on the opposite shore of the river, appeared a solitary figure. It was wrapped in a black cloak that seemed to absorb the surrounding light, creating a void in the air itself. The face remained hidden in the shadow of a deep hood, but I could feel its gaze upon us, cold and eternal like the stars. It raised a hand, a slow and deliberate gesture, and the walls of the black fortress opened. There were no visible doors before, yet now an opening manifested, as if the stone itself had dissolved or had never been solid. From inside emanated a golden light, warm and inviting, in stark contrast to the grim desolation that surrounded us. "Come," said the figure, with a voice that was not a voice, but a thought that formed directly in my mind, a whisper that seemed to come from every direction and from none. "Come and find refuge. Your battle is over. Peace awaits you." The words carried a promise of relief, of an end to suffering. I felt their seductive power, the desire to believe, to abandon myself to the hope they offered. But something within me, perhaps that spark of Athenian distrust, that skepticism that Socrates had elevated to a philosophical virtue, held me back. Our generals looked at each other, undecided. I saw in their eyes the same conflict that tormented me. Exhaustion and hope on one side, suspicion and terror on the other. Then Clearchus, always the first to act, the most decisive in moments of crisis, took a step forward. The Persians would betray us, he said, but perhaps here the rules are different. I see no other way. He advanced toward the figure and the fortress, dragging himself through the water that now seemed to hinder his movement with a viscous resistance. The other generals followed after a moment of hesitation. First Menon, too eager, then Agis and Socrates, and finally Proxenus, who turned one last time toward the troops. "We will follow this path," he announced, his voice attempting to regain the assurance of a commander. "Keep your shields high and your spears ready, and pray to the gods even if they seem to have abandoned us." "No," I shouted, my voice breaking in my throat parched by terror. "It's a trap, don't you see? It's all they've wanted from the beginning." But my voice was lost in the noise of the water and the cries of the wounded, in the confused clamor of the army in disarray that was already beginning to move toward the promise of salvation. "Don't trust them, don't cross," I continued to shout, but it was like screaming in a dream. No one seemed to hear me, or if they heard me, they chose to ignore my words. The generals, followed by the surviving soldiers, advanced toward the open fortress, as if hypnotized by the promise of security, of a refuge from this aquatic hell. I saw them cross the threshold one after another, swallowed by the golden light that, as they approached, seemed to lose heat and assume an algid metallic quality, like the gleam of a drawn blade. Only I remained behind, paralyzed by a terror that went beyond physical fear, a terror that had its roots in the certainty that the fortress was not salvation, but damnation. I tried to move, to follow them and stop them, but my body refused to obey. The water around my legs seemed to solidify, holding me anchored in place. "The betrayal has already happened," the hooded figure whispered to me, now suddenly at my side, though an instant before it had been on the opposite shore. Its breath had the ancient smell of the tomb and of spices I did not recognize. "You cannot save them. You cannot save yourself." "Who are you?" I asked, my voice little more than a breath. The hood lifted slightly, allowing me to glimpse the face beneath. I felt the blood freeze in my veins. It was not a human face, nor divine. It was something more ancient, a face that seemed formed from segments of other faces, like a living mosaic composed of the features of 1,000 dead. I recognized Persian characteristics, traces of Achaemenid nobles, but also Greek, Egyptian, Scythian, Babylonian traits. It was the collective face of all those who had died for our wars, for our hubris. "I am what you have created," replied the entity. "I am the fruit of your betrayals, your ambitions, your broken oaths. I am the harvest that grows from spilled blood." I turned to face it, to counter, to deny, but there was no one. Only the echo of those words, which resonated in my mind as the current of the river, suddenly turned impetuous again, dragged me backward, toward the shore from which we had started, away from my companions who marched unaware toward the trap. The last thing I saw, before darkness enveloped me completely, was the door of the fortress closing behind the last Greek soldier with a thud that seemed to shake the very foundations of that spectral world. A greenish light glowed for an instant from the loopholes of the fortress, accompanied by a chorus of screams that reached me muffled by distance. Then silence. A silence so deep that I could hear my heart beating ever more slowly as the black waters dragged me toward oblivion. Chapter 3. A scream tore through the night, waking me with a start. I jolted on my bed, my heart pounding in my chest like a crazed blacksmith, my body clammy with cold sweat that mingled with the dawn dew filtered through the fabric of the tent. For a moment I didn't understand where I was, the horror of the dream still so vivid as to confuse reality with the nightmare. Then I recognized it. I was in my tent, in the camp on the banks of the Tigris. The cry was not part of my dream. It was real, and it continued, soon joining with others in a growing chorus of panic and confusion that spread from the eastern end of the camp like a tidal wave. "What's happening?" I asked, grabbing by the arm an Arcadian hoplite who was running by, his eyes wide and his face as pale as a corpse. He looked at me with bulging eyes, almost without recognizing me. "Betrayal!" he exclaimed, his voice broken by terror. "The generals!" Tissaphernes invited them to a banquet in his tent and made them prisoners. They've been chained like slaves and are being taken away toward the capital. His words hit me like a punch in the stomach, almost doubling me over. The dream, the black river, the lost battle, the deceptive fortress. It was all a presage. The gods had sent me a warning through Morpheus, and I had not understood it in time, had not known how to interpret the signs, read the message hidden in the dream images. "Are you sure?" I asked, gripping his arm more tightly, my fingers leaving white marks on his tanned skin. "All the generals tell me the truth. All of them," the Arcadian confirmed, freeing himself from my grip with a jerk to continue his desperate run toward his own unit. "Clearchus, Proxenus, Menon, Agers, all of them. None returned from the meeting with Tissaphernes. They say they've been beheaded, or perhaps they're being taken to the king in chains. We are lost, Athenian, without commanders, in a foreign land, surrounded." I remained immobile as reality overlapped with the dream in a terrifying parallel, as if the fates themselves had woven a tapestry in which dream and waking were indistinguishable threads of the same design. The battle lost against the shadows in the Black River was the presage of the loss of our leaders. The impotence of the generals in the dream reflected their vulnerability to deception. The hooded figure, the deceptive fortress, everything pointed to this betrayal. "The betrayal has already happened," I murmured, repeating the words of the spectral figure, a shiver running down my spine despite the heat that was beginning to rise from the ground with the first rays of the sun. Around me, the chaos increased. I saw the reactions of the different ethnic groups, exactly as in the dream. The Spartans tried to maintain discipline, arranging themselves in defensive formations around their tents, but without Clearchus, they seemed disoriented, like a body without a head. The Boeotians, always more inclined to religiosity, gathered in circles of prayer around small improvised altars, imploring gods that seemed to have abandoned us. The Thessalians, distrustful by nature, already accused each other, suspecting traitors in their ranks, hands running to the hilts of swords, faces contorted by anger and fear. The Arcadians shouted and lamented openly, their usual composure swept away by panic, some already gathering their belongings, as if preparing for a disorderly flight. "We must gather," a strong voice rose above the chaos, clear and authoritative. I turned and saw Xenophon, the young Athenian who until now had been little more than an observer, a follower of Proxenus without official command, more philosopher than soldier. Yet now he stood on a cart, his figure silhouetted against the increasingly illuminated sky. He did not yet wear complete armor, only a white chiton that shone in the first rays of the sun and a xiphos at his belt, but his posture emanated a natural authority that attracted gazes. Soldiers of Greece, unite, not all is lost. We are still the 10,000. Beside him I saw Chaeresophus, the Spartan who now, in the absence of Clearchus, naturally represented the Lacedaemonian contingent. Their union, the Athenian and the Spartan, in this moment of crisis, was something I would never have predicted, an unlikely alliance born of desperate necessity. Their city-states had massacred each other in the recent Peloponnesian War, and now their representatives stood side by side, united against a common threat. Almost unconsciously, I moved toward them, as if drawn by an invisible force. It was as if a part of my dream was being realized in a different, perhaps better way. Others followed my example, more and more soldiers gathering around the cart, desperately seeking guidance, hope, a sign that not all was lost. Xenophon spoke, his voice steady and resolute, the words flowing with the eloquence that only Athenians educated in the school of the sophists knew how to master. He described our situation without mincing words. Our generals probably dead or prisoners, we trapped in the heart of the Persian Empire, surrounded by enemies, thousands of stadia from home. But then, like a skilled orator trained in the schools of Athens, he transformed desperation into determination. "Greeks!" he thundered, his face illuminated not only by the rising sun, but by an inner fire. "We fought at Cunaxa, and we won. The Persian phalanxes broke against our courage like waves against a cliff. They attacked us 10-1, and we are still here. We must remember who we are. Spartans who stopped Xerxes' entire army at Thermopylae, Athenians who destroyed the Persian fleet at Salamis, Boeotians who triumphed at Plataea. We are not prisoners, we are not fugitives. We are an army. And as long as we remain united, we can overcome any obstacle." Chaeresophus spoke after him, with the characteristic brevity of the Spartans, simple words but charged with centuries of military tradition. "Spartans do not fear death," he said, "but neither are we fools who seek it without reason. We have a path to travel, and we will travel it together. We must appoint new commanders, reorganize the army, begin the retreat following the Tigris northward, toward the mountains where peoples less hostile to Greeks live, toward the sea, toward home." As I listened to them, I could not help but think of my dream. As chance would have it, the two men were absent in my nightmare of the Black River. They were not among the generals who led the disastrous crossing, who fell into the trap of the fortress. Perhaps it was a sign. Perhaps the gods, while punishing us for our hubris with the loss of our original leaders, were also offering us a path to redemption, a second chance through these new leaders who had remained in the shadows until this crucial moment. I was not the only one thinking this. I saw hope reborn in the faces that surrounded me, a renewed sense of possibility that spread like a flame in a dry forest. The assembly continued, with animated discussions about strategies and dangers, proposals and objections, but the air of desperate resignation began to dissolve, replaced by a cautious but real determination. Something important was happening. An army of disparate mercenaries was transforming into something more cohesive, more determined. A common identity was being born that transcended rivalries between city-states. In the end, an agreement was reached. The army would be reorganized under new leaders, with Xenophon and Chaeresophus in supreme command, flanked by a council of captains representing the different ethnic units. Each unit would elect its own lochagoi, captains responsible for 100 men. The march northward would begin at the following dawn, after burning the carts and non-essential equipment to accelerate the pace. As the assembly dispersed and the soldiers returned to their quarters to prepare, I found myself face to face with Xenophon. I did not know if he had noticed me previously among the crowd, but now his intelligent and penetrating eyes studied me with interest. "You're Lykon, aren't you?" he asked. "You served under Proxenus." "Yes, strategos," I replied, surprised that he knew my name. I was neither an officer nor a particularly distinguished soldier, just one of the many Athenian veterans who had followed Proxenus in this cursed expedition. "I heard you were on guard last night at the western edge of the camp." His voice was calm but intense, his gaze acute. "Did you see anything suspicious? Anything that might have warned us of this betrayal?" I hesitated. How could I explain my dream, the presage that I had not understood until it was too late? He would have taken me for a madman, or worse, for a coward seeking to justify his inaction with superstitions and fantasies. But something in his gaze encouraged me to sincerity. Xenophon was not just a soldier, but also a philosopher, a follower of Socrates, a man accustomed to contemplating the depths of the human soul, to considering the mysteries that extend beyond the visible world. "I had a dream," I confessed, my voice low but firm. "A terrible dream. A black river, the dead dragging us into the water, our generals leading us into a trap, a fortress that promised salvation but offered only death." I expected incredulity, perhaps even derision. Instead, Xenophon nodded thoughtfully, as if my words confirmed something he already suspected. "Dreams are messages from the gods," he said, placing a hand on my shoulder. "Unfortunately, we often understand their meaning too late." Socrates too spoke of the importance of dreams. It was his daemonion that guided him, that inner voice that warned him when he was about to make a wrong decision. "Do you believe the gods are punishing us?" I asked, the question that had tormented me since we had begun this expedition. For having served a barbarian against the legitimate king, for having sold ourselves as mercenaries to whoever offered more gold, for our hubris. "Perhaps," he admitted, looking toward the river that flowed placidly under the first rays of the sun, so different from the black river of my dream, yet, in some way, disturbingly similar in its impassivity. "The Persians have a concept they call Arta, the cosmic order, very similar to our idea of Dike, of divine justice. Perhaps we disturbed this order, serving the usurper against the legitimate king. But if so, the gods are also offering us a possibility of expiation. Otherwise, why send you a warning? Why spare us?" "No, Lykon, I believe the gods have a design for us, and part of that design is our long march toward home." His words seemed to ignite a spark inside me, a glimmer of hope where before there was only despair. He was a man capable of finding meaning even in the abyss, of seeing a path even in the thickest darkness. "I will be at your side, strategos," I promised, bringing my fist to my chest in a military salute that I had not offered with sincerity for a long time. "Where you lead, I will follow." Xenophon smiled, a tired but authentic smile, which illuminated his aristocratic features, giving him a younger, more vulnerable appearance. We will need every man, Lykon. The road will be long and difficult, but every step will bring us closer to home. I took leave of him and returned to my tent to prepare for departure. As I gathered my essential things, armor, weapons, a couple of spare sandals, a heavy cloak for cold nights, a small icon of Athene that had accompanied me in every battle and rid myself of the superfluous, I could not help but think again of the black river of my dream, of the shadows and the dead, of the deceptive fortress that promised salvation but concealed only damnation. Divine punishment had arrived with the loss of our generals, but perhaps it was not the end. Perhaps it was the beginning of a new trial, of a path toward expiation. The ways of the gods are inscrutable, said the priests of Delphi, but perhaps this betrayal, this apparent disaster, was actually an opportunity for redemption. I exited the tent and looked toward the Tigris, which flowed impassively, unaware of the human dramas unfolding on its banks. It was not black as in my dream, but sparkled with gold and orange under the light of sunset, its waters reflecting the fiery sky in a mirage of liquid flames, a symbol of life, not death, of hope, not despair. It has begun, I murmured, as the army prepared for the march. Thousands of men adjusting armor, sharpening swords, filling water skins for the long journey that awaited us. The Catabasis, the long descent, the journey home through hostile lands and unthinkable dangers. But we were not alone. The gods were watching us, and perhaps, just perhaps, they would guide us towards salvation if we knew how to listen to their signs and find the strength to expiate our guilt. With this thought, I returned to my Athenian comrades, ready to take my place in the formation, to begin the long march toward the unknown that awaited us. The sun was rising, tinting the Mesopotamian plain red like a presage of blood. But on the horizon, toward the north, where the mountains awaited us, and beyond the sea and Greece, the last stars could still be seen, distant beacons indicating the route toward home. You have listened to The Black River, a Pseudobiblia narration. We hope you enjoyed this journey. Remember to like the video and subscribe to the channel to not miss our weekly audiobook every Friday at 9 p.m. and to explore our playlists for other genres. Thank you for listening. This work is a work of fiction. Names, characters, places, and events are the product of the author's imagination or are used fictitiously. Any resemblance to actual persons, events, or places existing or having existed is purely coincidental.